Hey, it's Deep in the Reads again. A few months ago, I posted a huge book haul video because I went to my library and saw that they were discarding all of these vintage sci-fi and fantasy novels for free. So naturally, I brought a bunch of them home with me, and since I didn't know much about the genre, I made a poll and asked you to vote for which one you think I should read and review first. Well, the winner of that poll was The Martian Chronicles by Ray Bradbury. So that's the book I'm going to be talking about today. Bradbury probably doesn't need any introduction. He was an incredibly prolific sci-fi author who dabbled in other genres as well. He was working from the 40s to the 2010s, so 70 years of writing short stories and scripts and novels, some of which became very famous, like Fahrenheit 451. That book is obviously a very big socio-political commentary, so he's got sort of this high-minded thing where he's using genre fiction to comment on the world around him. Yet on the other hand, he is also, he wrote for pulp magazines for boys and young men and things like that. So he doesn't take himself too seriously either. It's got that vintage, cheesy charm to it. And The Martian Chronicles is a great example of how to have your feet in both of those camps. Now, The Martian Chronicles isn't a typical novel. Instead, it's a collection of short stories which are interconnected in such a way that makes for good reading if you want to read it cover to cover. The stories were written between 1946 and 1950, so those very important post-war years for America. Ray Bradbury uses The Martian Chronicles to comment on a lot of it. So although this book is very silly and zany in places, it also has some food for thought. The Martian Chronicles tells the typical sci-fi story of aliens invading a planet. It just so happens that the aliens are humans from Earth, and the planet in question is Mars. It's about the colonization of Mars. So in the first few stories, we see the first attempts to set a foothold on Mars, but all the attempts are botched. For one reason or another, the humans get rebuffed, or they run afoul of the Martians. But gradually throughout these stories, the humans really get a foothold on Mars, and that's when these two cultures collide, and in the process, all of this history and this culture begins to be lost forever, and the humans just continue in their blind lust for conquest and technological advancement at the cost of everything else. The writing is probably as accessible as you're expecting it to be. In fact, I would go so far as to say that Bradbury probably had teenagers in mind when he was writing this. It's definitely something I could have seen myself reading if I was in like 7th or 8th grade, for example. The stories range quite a bit in terms of their length and their tone. Some of the stories are 20 pages or more, while others are only a few paragraphs and are kind of like interludes or to set something up that comes back in a later story. In terms of the tone, of course, you've got that 50s vintage charm to the whole thing, but some of the stories are silly and funny, some of them are adventurous and fast-paced, some of them are very thoughtful, or they're ominous or disturbing. Some of them give me that Twilight Zone vibe for sure. One of the stories is called There Will Come Soft Rains, and it's only like 6 pages long, and all it does is describe a smart home and the environment around it, and yet it's easily one of the more effective and ominous stories in the whole thing. And then with another story, I was surprised to find it felt very familiar, and I looked it up and found out that it inspired an old episode of SpongeBob SquarePants, so I thought that that was pretty cool too. Despite the setting and the premise, The Martian Chronicles is really more of a fantasy story than a science fiction story. It's full of magic and mysticism. The Martians have all of these strange powers that are kind of like wizards. And in fact, Bradbury makes use of this old fantasy trope, this idea of man's world and the world of the fairies being separated and you can't mingle them or one will be destroyed. You can also throw out any of that high, hard science fiction logic right out the window because the humans are able to breathe on Mars. This was written at a time before the space race, so there was no need to make space travel feel scientific and feasible. Instead, all of the sci-fi trappings end up feeling quite magical, and the authors of the time were pulling on old adventure stories from the age of exploration as a source of their inspiration. you're probably not going to be surprised when I tell you that Bradbury spends a lot of time paralleling the Martians to indigenous peoples of the Americas. He's talking a lot about settler colonialism. It's definitely interesting that he is using this new age of exploration in outer space as a way to comment and warn us about the follies of our last age of exploration. And it's also very daring for its time because this was written in the 1950s and 40s, a time when the general population was absolutely not aware of the injustices being done to indigenous peoples. And for him to comment on it, to me, is pretty bold. Now, again, it is a very old book, so he does lean into noble savage tropes at times, but on the whole, you understand he's coming from a good place. Same thing with another point in the book when he comments on racial segregation. There's a story where all of these black people decide to leave the segregated South and establish their own place on Mars. Bradbury is just tearing segregationist talking points to pieces throughout the story. There is a lot of the N-word, but again, his heart's in the right place, so it makes sense. And then on top of that, you've got all of the typical themes that you would expect from a science fiction writer in the post-war period. He's talking about the atom bomb or suspicion with the Russians, and also all of these post-war optimisms like, the rise of the middle class and all these new technologies to make our lives more convenient. It's a very interesting mix of social commentary, and Bradbury finds all of these great ways to intermingle all these themes together. He's looking around and trying to find reasons to be optimistic about the future, but then he's also finding all these reasons to be absolutely terrified of the future. Science fiction is about writing technology, basically, and what's the technology he's seeing around him? He just saw World War II and the Holocaust and nuclear bombs being used on a civilian population. Mechanized warfare on a scale that would have been unimaginable to just the previous generation. So what the hell is the next generation going to bring? It makes total sense why he's pessimistic, and it's something I noticed as well in Isaac Asimov's collection called Nine Tomorrows, which deals with the same themes, was written around the same time. But the strength of the Martian Chronicles is that it has a trajectory to it. All the stories build on each other. And so the deeper you get into it, the more that pessimism shows up in the form of stories that are a little bit darker, a little bit more brooding, and kind of freak you out about the possibilities of where our future could go if we're not careful. And then you get left off with a pretty memorable ending in that last story there. So yeah, definitely has some solid points for sure. But it also has some of the drawbacks that you would expect of a short story collection. Some stories are going to be stronger than others. Some of them are very strong for me, like Usher the Second, There Will Come Soft Rains, or The Third Expedition, which I loved those. But then a lot of them are just kind of middling, and then some of them are so forgettable that they might not as well have even been in there. So it's a mixed bag, as you would expect, but that's kind of how I feel about most short story collections. They're about finding those golden gems among the rest of them. But that's not to say that the rest of the stories are bad or anything. They're fun, they're serviceable, they've got some stuff to say, some food for thought. I would give the book a 6.5 out of 10. I hope that doesn't sound too critical, because I definitely did get some enjoyment out of this book, and I'm glad I read it. It was my first experience with Ray Bradbury, and although not all of its stories are perfect, it's very short, so it's easy to spend the time with it. Short stories are not really my strong suit in any case, so if you're into sci-fi short stories from this era, I'm sure you will probably like it more than I did. I hope to read Fahrenheit 451 either this year or next, but probably next year, so I guess you have that to look forward to. But yeah, I've been deep in the reads. Hope you enjoyed my video, and I'll see you next time.